Vortex, the luminous tragedy of Vincent van Gogh. The following script is based upon the book titled Vincent van Gogh, a biographical study, authored by Julius Meier-Graefe and first published in the year 1922. Chapter 1: The Hunger in the Dark. To understand the light, one must first suffocate in the dark, before the sun of Provence burned the madness into his eyes, before the chrome yellow and the swirling cypress trees became the lexicon of modern art. Vincent van Gogh was a man buried alive. He did not begin as a painter. He began as a fanatic, a man starving for a holy connection that the world seemed determined to deny him. We find him not in a studio, but in the black, choking dust of the Borinage, a coal mining district in Belgium. In the winter of 1878, he is 25 years old, a failure by every bourgeois metric his family holds dear. He has failed as an art dealer, failed as a teacher, failed as a bookseller. Now he seeks to fail as a saint. He descends into the pit, the lay preacher who takes the gospel of Christ with a terrifying literalism. He gives away his money, his food, and eventually his clothes to the miners, dressing himself in a discarded soldier's sack and smearing soot on his face to bridge the gap between the pulpit and the purgatory of the mine shafts. He wants to be one of them. He wants to abase himself to find God. But the church does not want a saint. They want a functionary. They are horrified by his excess of zeal, his refusal to maintain the dignity of the clergy. When they expel him, citing his lack of eloquence and his erratic behavior, the rejection triggers a collapse that is absolute. He has been rejected by God's representatives on earth. He sits in the hovel he rents, listening to the coughing of the miners, surrounded by a damp, grey misery that seeps into the bone. It is here, in this crushing silence, that the transmutation occurs. The religious fervour, having no outlet in the church, does not dissipate. It displaces. It shifts violently from theology to observation. If he cannot save the souls of these men and women, he will document their suffering. He picks up a piece of charcoal. He begins to scratch at the paper. This is the birth of the art credo that will sustain him until the bullet strikes his chest. He believes that to draw the peasant is to perform a religious act. He looks at the miners, the weavers, the women bending over the soil, and he sees something ancient and sacred. He calls it the sour, a motif that will haunt him for the next decade. But in these early days, there is no sun behind the sewer's head. There is only the grim, relentless weight of the earth. His early work is an exercise in heaviness. He rejects the dodges and delusions of the academics, the pretty, polished techniques of the salons. He wants the mud. He wants the truth of the potato field. He writes to his brother Theo, the only umbilical cord connecting him to sanity, speaking of a desire to capture the essence rather than the likeness. He studies the Dutch masters, not for their refinement, but for their shadows. He uses bitumen, bistri, and the colors of a ploughed field in winter. He is teaching himself to see, but his vision is tunnel-like, focused entirely on the grim reality of labor. He moves through the Netherlands, Etten, The Hague, Nuenen, carrying this darkness with him like a physical burden. He clashes with his family, particularly his father, a parson who cannot understand why his son insists on dressing like a tramp and bringing models from the lower classes into the rectory. Vincent is abrasive, impossible, vibrating with a nervous energy that alienates everyone but Theo. He is a sick man in the eyes of his community, a social pariah who stares too hard and speaks too intensely. Yet, in this period of hunger in the dark, the technical foundations are being laid with agonizing slowness. He draws hands, knotty, work-worn hands, hundreds of times. He draws boots that look like they have walked through hell. He is obsessed with the architecture of the human form under duress. He is not trying to please the eye. He is trying to assault the conscience. He writes that he wants his figures to look as though they were painted with the earth they sow. But the earth is consuming him. By 1885, after the death of his father and the scandal surrounding his The Potato Eaters, a masterpiece of gloom and grotesque realism, Vincent reaches a dead end. The dark palette has given him everything it can. He has mastered the shadow, but he is suffocating in it. The grey skies of the north, the endless rain, the grim Calvinist morality. It is all closing in. He feels the stagnation. He creates, but he does not sing. He hears rumors from the south. He hears from Theo about a new movement in Paris, a group of painters who have abandoned the brown source of the Dutch tradition for something called light. They speak of violet shadows, of sunlight captured in broken strokes, of a peinture clair that renders the world with a scientific brilliance. Vincent looks at his own canvases, dark as the bottom of a mine shaft, and realizes he is painting the past. The hunger that drove him into the coal mines now drives him toward a different kind of salvation. He packs his meager belongings. He leaves the heavy, peat-scented air of the Netherlands behind. He boards a train, leaving the darkness of the 19th century soil to hurtle toward the blinding, modern incandescence of Paris. Chapter 2. The Paris Crucible. The steam of the locomotive dissolves into the grey slate of the Gare du Nord, releasing him not just into a city, but into a centrifuge. It is March 1886. The silence of the Borinage, that crushing, holy silence of the mines, is instantly shattered by the roar of the metropole. Vincent steps onto the platform, a man carved from the heavy, peat-scented clay of the north, carrying a mind still darkened by the shadows of the pulpit. He has come to live with Theo, to crash into the small apartment on the Rue Lepic, high on the Butte Montmartre, where the city stretches out below them like a vast, heaving ocean of stone, He arrives expecting to find art. Instead, he finds a revolution that blinds him. In the Goupil Gallery and in the experimental studios of the Petit Boulevard, he is confronted by a violence of colour he cannot comprehend. He stands before the canvases of Monet, Pissarro, and Renoir, and he is paralysed. Where he has spent 10 years worshipping the brown source of the Dutch masters, the bitumen, the bistri, the sombre mud that equates piety with darkness. These men have dipped their brushes into the spectrum of the sun itself. They speak of peinture claire, a painting of light, where shadows are not black but violet, where the air vibrates with a scientific brilliance that renders the world in broken strokes of pure pigment. It is a shock that is almost physical. He looks at his own canvases, the potato eaters, the heavy, clumsy peasants born of earth and darkness, and sees them suddenly as corpses. They are relics of a past he must amputate. He writes that he has done with grace, that he must scour the mud from his eyes. But the transition is a torture. He is a man trying to speak a new language, with a tongue thickened by silence. He attacks the canvas with a desperate fury, trying to force his heavy hand to dance the light, staccato rhythm of the Impressionists. He paints flowers, not for their beauty, but to practice the scales of this new aggressive colour theory. He paints Père Tanguy, the old colour grinder, surrounding him with a riot of Japanese prints, trying to flatten the world, to banish the shadows, to make the canvas scream with the scintillating vitality he sees around him. But Paris is not just a studio. It is a debating society, a babel of gabblers who dissect art until it bleeds. He sits in the smoky cafes of Montmartre, the Café du Tambourin, the Nouvelle Athènes, listening to the theories of Seurat and Signac. They speak of the point, the dot of pure colour that mixes in the eye of the beholder, of optical laws and complementary vibrations. To Vincent, who seeks God in the soil, this is a cold, sterile science. It is an atmosphere of obelisks, a structured anarchy, where every painter is a brick in a wall of theory, yet no one seems to have a soul. He argues, he shouts, he drinks absinthe until his mind reels, terrified that this scientific brilliance is stripping the humanity from his work. He feels like a savage among the professors, a man who wants to paint the heat of the blood, but is handed a thermometer. The novelty of the peinture claire begins to curdle into a new form of despair. He realizes that while he has learned to break up the light, he has lost the weight of the world. His brushwork, once heavy and authoritative, now stammers. He paints self-portraits in which his eyes look out with a haunted manic intensity, the eyes of a sick man who knows he is disintegrating. He confesses to Theo that he is a pessimist, a creature of frozen instincts, who cannot thrive in the paved grey labyrinth of the city. The intellectualism of Paris, the endless talk, the laissez-aller and anarchy of the artistic cliques begins to suffocate him just as surely as the coal dust of the Borinage. He is 27 months in this crucible, and the metal is melting, but it is not taking the shape he desires. The winter of 1887 descends, and with it, a damp, penetrating cold that seeps into his chest and his mind. The grey skies of Paris, which the Impressionists render with such delicate affection, to him look only like the lid of a coffin. He begins to cough, his body weakened by alcohol and the fever of the brain. He looks at the work of his contemporaries. Beautiful, light, airy, and feels a terrible need for something else. Not the polite sunlight of the Seine, but a sun that burns. He needs a light that does not just illuminate, but consumes. He remembers the Japanese prints he has pinned to his walls, the flat, bold colours, the lack of shadows, the eternal frozen sunshine of a land he has never seen. He begins to believe that this land exists, not in the Far East, but in the south of France, a place where the light is so strong it washes away the details and leaves only the essence, a place where he can be a simple worshipper of the eternal Buddha, rather than a debater in a cafe. He tells Theo he must go. He must go down into the earth, naked once more. He boards a train again, fleeing the sophistication of the capital, fleeing the grey intellectualism that threatens to rot his art credo, hurtling south toward a promise of heat that will either cure him or burn him to ash. Chapter 3. The Japanese Dream. The train stops, but the heat does not arrive. It is February 1888, and Vincent steps onto the platform at Arles, not into a blaze of southern gold, but into 2 feet of snow. The studio of the south, the promised land of warmth and colour, where he hoped to heal his fraying nerves, lies buried under a silence as white and cold as the grave he fled in the north. But to Vincent, this is not a disappointment. It is a revelation. As he walks through the town, observing the sharp, angular silhouettes of the snowy roofs against a pale sky, he does not see a frozen Provence. He sees the winter landscapes of Hokusai and Hiroshige. The world has been flattened, purified of the Parisian grime, reduced to the pristine clarity of a woodblock print. He writes to Theo that he feels as though he is already in Japan. The conviction is instant and absolute. This is the place where the Pontchartrain will finally breathe. The snow melts, and the Japanese dream explodes. The transition is not gradual. It is a violent eruption of biology. The almond trees burst into bloom. Clouds of fragile white and pink hovering against skies of a blue so intense it feels solid. Vincent sets up his easel in the orchards, working with a frenzy that alarms the locals. He is no longer painting pictures. He is trying to catch the fleeting soul of the blossom before the wind scatters it. He paints the pink orchard, the white night orchard, attacking the canvas with a speed that mimics the urgency of nature itself. He tells Theo he is in a fury of work, that the trees are blossoming and he must not lose a single moment. This is the Japan of the West. In his mind, the Japanese artist is a simple workman, a philosopher who studies a single blade of grass until he understands the universe. Vincent seeks this simplicity here. He sheds the intellectual debates of the Paris cafes, the gabble of the boulevards, to become a simple worshipper of the eternal Buddha. He looks at the Arlesian women, with their structured costumes and distinct profiles, and sees the geishas of Utamaro. He looks at the flat, green plains stretching toward the Crow, and sees the minimalist landscapes of the floating world. He eliminates shadows from his work, flattening the perspective, using color not to describe form, but to express emotion. The brown source of his Dutch period is gone forever. His palette is now a prism of emerald green, royal blue, and the sulphurous yellow that will soon consume him. But the dream is solitary. The town of Arles views him with suspicion, a red-headed madman who stares too hard and paints too fast. He is the furu, the crazy redhead. The loneliness is crushing, yet he transmutes it into a grand philanthropic vision. He conceives of the studio of the South, brotherhood of artists who will live and work together in this new light, sharing expenses and inspiration, protected from the commercial wolves of Paris. He drafts the architecture of this utopia in his letters, begging Theo to send Gauguin, the savage from Brittany, to join him. He believes that if they can just stand together, here in the sun, they can create an art that will console a suffering humanity. He lives on coffee and crusts, funneling every franc from Theo into tubes of paint. He is buying the sun by the ounce. The sheer physical output is staggering, canvas after canvas stacking up in his rented room. A rich harvest that he cannot sell but refuses to stop gathering. He is a man possessed by the clarity of the light, convinced that he is laying the foundation for a new renaissance. But the Japanese serenity is fragile. The southern wind begins to rise, rattling the windows and shaking the easel he must now stake into the ground. While the cost of his wild extravagance in paint begins to demand a physical price his body can no longer afford. Chapter 4: Chrome Yellow and the Mistral. The wind is not a metaphor. In Provence, the Mistral is a physical assault. A relentless, dry northern gale that scours the sky of clouds and drives the inhabitants into the shelter of their stone farmhouses. But Vincent does not seek shelter. As the spring deepens into the blistering heat of summer, he moves further into the fields, declaring war on the elements. The Japanese serenity of the orchards has vanished. replaced by a violent atmospheric turbulence that demands a new kind of engineering. To paint in the Mistral is to fight a wrestling match with the canvas. He drives iron spikes into the dry earth to anchor his easel, lashing the frame to the legs with rope, struggling to keep the vibrating linen still enough to catch the light. It is here, amidst this roaring wind and blinding sun, that the peinture clair of Paris undergoes a radical transmutation. The polite, scientific dots of the Impressionists are blown away. In their place emerges a technique of muscular desperation. Vincent squeezes the paint directly from the tube onto the canvas, bypassing the palette entirely. He is sculpting in color. He uses chrome yellow, a pigment derived from lead chromate, toxic and brilliant, with a recklessness that borders on addiction. He is no longer simply observing the light. He is attempting to ingest it, to transfer the very nuclear fusion of the sun onto a two-dimensional plane. He writes to Theo of a high yellow note that he must reach, a pitch of intensity that requires him to exaggerate the essential and leave the obvious vague. The wheat fields are not merely grain, they are old gold, copper, and green gold, baked in a furnace that turns the soil to violet. He paints the sour, returning to his old biblical motif, but the dark, peasant gloom of the north is incinerated. The sun hangs behind the figure, not as a distant celestial body, but as a massive, halos-like disk of citron yellow. It floods the field with a spiritual radiation that turns the labor of agriculture into a sacred act. This is the birth of the vibrant impasto. The paint rises from the surface in thick, jagged ridges, casting their own tiny shadows. If you run your hand over the canvas, though the museum guards would never permit it, you would feel the topography of his struggle. He is working at a speed that terrifies him, driven by a lucidity that feels like a fever. He completes a canvas in a single sitting, sometimes in under an hour, racing against the shifting shadows and his own exhaustion. He tells Theo that he is working like a steam engine, that the sheer cost of the paint is draining him. Yet to stop now would be to let the fire go out. But the light of Arles does not end at sunset. Vincent, insomnia-ridden and buzzing with caffeine, discovers that the night is more alive and more richly colored than the day. He drags his easel down to the banks of the Rhône. He creates a hat fitted with candles, a precarious crown of fire that allows him to see his palette in the dark. He paints the gas lights of the town reflected in the water as bars of gold dropping into the gloomy blue depths. He looks up and sees not black, but a royal blue, pierced by stars that pulse with a scintillating vitality. He is mapping the infinite, finding comfort in the vastness of the cosmos that the small, petty world of men denies him. Yet, amidst this explosion of productivity, the loneliness is a constant studio of the South is still just a theory, a one-man monastery. To combat this, he begins a series of paintings intended to seduce a companion. He paints the Poet's Garden, a public park across from his yellow house. He envisions it not just as a collection of trees, but as a sanctuary where the poet of the future, the artist who will lead the new Renaissance, might walk and think. The trees are rendered with strange, twisting limbs. The foliage, a dense tapestry of greens and blacks, a place of shade and refuge from the relentless Provençal sun. He is preparing the stage. He is building a temple. Every stroke of chrome yellow, every tube of expensive cobalt blue is an investment in a dream that is rapidly becoming an obsession. He surveys the stacks of drying canvases in his small room, the sunflowers, the sowers, the night cafes, the gardens. It is a rich harvest, a staggering accumulation of genius gathered in isolation. But a harvest is meaningless without a feast, and a temple is silent without a high priest. He looks toward the north, toward Paris, waiting for the one man he believes can validate this suffering, the one man who can turn this solitary struggle into a movement. Chapter 5: The Yellow House Utopia. The temple has an address. It stands on the corner of the Place Lamartine, a building that Vincent does not merely rent, but inhales. It is number 2, the right wing, a modest structure with a facade of sulfur yellow under a sky of hard cobalt blue. To the locals, it is just a house, perhaps a bit dilapidated, smelling of the nearby railway. To Vincent, it is the fortress of the future. It is the studio of the South. For months, he has lived in transient squalor, a boarder in rooms that smelled of other men's despair. Now, he has walls, and these walls require a sacrifice. The allowance from Theo, already stretched thin by the consumption of paint, is now diverted with a manic discipline toward the domestic. He starves himself to buy chairs. He forgoes tobacco to pay for a gas line so that the painting does not have to stop when the sun fails. He is not furnishing a home. He is curating a monastery for a new order of monks, the Apostles of Light, who will descend from the grey north to worship the sun. He writes to Theo with a domestic pride that is heartbreaking in its simplicity. He describes the purchase of 12 chairs, a mirror, a small table. But the centerpiece of this obsession is the guest room. It is not for him. His own room is Spartan, a cell for a worker. The guest room is a shrine, waiting for the arrival of the high priest. He buys a walnut bed, heavy and elegant, a piece of bourgeois solidity that stands in stark contrast to his own iron cot. He wants the room to feel like a boudoir of a woman, artistic and refined. He is building a trap of comfort to snare Paul Gauguin. Gauguin is the linchpin. In Vincent's fevered architecture, Gauguin is not just a painter, he is the master. The man with the commercial savvy and the hardened soul necessary to lead this new brotherhood. Vincent casts himself as the abbot, the gardener, the one who prepares the soil so the master may sow. He frets over the delay. He calculates the train fare. He sends letter after letter, a bombardment of pleas and logic, trying to convince the older artist that Arles is not a backwater, but the crucible of the avant-garde. But a room needs more than furniture. It needs a soul. Vincent looks at the white walls of the guest chamber and decides they are too silent. He determines to make them sing. He conceives of a decoration scheme that will rival the stained glass of Gothic cathedrals, but drawn from the soil of Provence. He will paint the sun. This is the genesis of the sunflowers. He attacks the subject with the same violence he applied to the harvest. He knows the flowers will fade quickly in the heat, so he paints in a marathon of execution, starting at sunrise and not stopping until the petals droop. He paints sunflowers in a vase, 3 blooms, then 12, then 14. He abandons the realistic shadows of the Dutch tradition entirely. He commits a heresy of color. He paints yellow on yellow. Chrome yellow flowers against a sulfur yellow background, held in a yellow vase, resting on a yellow table. It is a symphony of a single note, played at different octaves. He uses the impasto so thickly that the petals stand off the canvas like clay. Sculpture in oil. He wants the pictures to vibrate, to emit light rather than just reflect it. He tells Theo he wants them to have the effect of stained glass windows in a church. They are not botanical studies. They are batteries of gratitude, charging in the sun, waiting to release their energy upon the guest who will sleep beneath them. He works himself into a state of exhaustion, driven by the fear that Gauguin will arrive and find the house naked. He hangs the canvases. He scrubs the floor. He arranges the chairs. He is a man preparing for a wedding. Terrified the bride will not show. The solitude he has endured for months is about to end, and the silence of the studio will be replaced by the dialogue of masters. He believes, with a desperate naivety, that the studio of the South will solve everything. His poverty, his loneliness, his madness. If he can just anchor himself to another human being, perhaps the vortex in his mind will slow down. Then the telegram comes. It is October 23rd, 1888. Paul Gauguin arrives before dawn. He steps off the train, a man of heavy eyelids and cynical charm, carrying the dust of Brittany and a profound skepticism about this tropical experiment. Vincent greets him with the frantic energy of a spaniel. He shows him the house, the gas jets, the walnut bed, the sunflowers burning on the walls. He shows him the studio, stacked with the rich harvest of the summer, the sour, the night cafe, the starry night over the Rhone. Gauguin looks. He nods. He is impressed, but he is cool. He brings with him the air of Paris, the arrogance of the Bourse, and a painting technique that relies on the mind, not the eye. He unpacks his canvas. He takes the head of the table. The brotherhood of two has begun. For a moment, the dream holds. They cook together. They drink absinthe in the cafe. They visit the brothels. They set their easels side by side in the Alleskamps, painting the falling leaves. But the house is small. The walls are thin, and the air in the yellow house, supercharged by Vincent's expectations and the lingering heat of the autumn, begins to thicken with a tension that is not artistic but chemical. The honeymoon of the studio of the South is brief. As the winter winds begin to rattle the shutters of the yellow house, the philosophical gap between the two men widens into a chasm that no amount of yellow paint can bridge. Chapter 6. The Titans Clash. The collision, when it comes, is not a crash of thunder, but a slow, grinding friction that wears down the soul. Paul Gauguin arrives in Arles not as a savior, but as a man calculating the odds. He steps into the yellow house with the cool, detached gaze of a stockbroker, which he once was, surveying a risky investment. To Vincent, trembling with the anticipation of a lonely man finally granted a companion, Gauguin is the Messiah of the South. To Gauguin, Vincent is a volatile, messy genius living in a squalor that needs to be managed. The studio of the South immediately divides into two distinct territories: the chaotic, paint-splattered orbit of the Dutchman and the orderly, cynical gravity of the Frenchman. For a brief, deceptive moment, the experiment seems to work. Gauguin, the older and more worldly figure, takes command of the domestic chaos. He installs a box for the household expenses, dividing the money Theo sends into rigid categories: for food, tobacco, and rent. He cooks. He cleans. He brings a terrifying sanity to Vincent's impulsive existence. Vincent, desperate to please his master, submits to this new discipline with the eagerness of a novitiate. He writes to Theo that the house has finally found its rhythm, that the presence of another painter has grounded him. But art is not born from domestic accountancy, and the peace is nothing more than the silence before a detonation. The true war is fought not over the grocery budget, but over the canvas. The philosophical chasm that opens between them is absolute. Vincent is a worshipper of nature. He needs the physical presence of the world to unlock his vision. He drags his easel into the biting wind, stands amidst the vines, and wrestles the changing light into submission. He devours the subject. His peinture claire is an act of observation pushed to the point of hallucination. He paints what is there, only louder, brighter, more desperate. Gauguin, conversely, despises this slavery to the eye. He urges Vincent to abandon the fields and work from the mysterious centers of thought. For Gauguin, art is an abstraction, a synthesis of memory and dream, where color is used not to describe a flower, but to evoke a mood. He tells Vincent to paint from imagination, to close his eyes to the clumsy reality of the world and look inward. Vincent tries. He forces himself to stay indoors, to paint memories of his mother and sister in the garden at Nouenon, attempting to adopt Gauguin's cloisonnism. Flat shapes, dark outlines, colors trapped like stained glass. But the results feel stiff to him, suffocated. He creates works that lack the scintillating vitality of his outdoor struggles. He feels he is lying to his own art credo. The studio becomes a boxing ring. As the weeks grind on, the polite discussions dissolve into electric arguments that leave Vincent drained and trembling. They debate the nature of truth in art until their throats are raw. Gauguin, arrogant and pedagogical, bullies Vincent with logic. Vincent, emotional and intuitive, defends himself with volume. Vincent reveres the Dutch masters, seeing the soul of God in the humble texture of a peasant's face. Gauguin dismisses them as boring naturalists. Vincent sees the sun as a deity. Gauguin sees it as a lighting effect. The master he invited to lead the brotherhood begins to look less like a high priest and more like a jailer. The tension is exacerbated by the relentless, grinding poverty. Despite Gauguin's box and his rigid budgeting, the money is never enough. The large hole in Theo's pocket grows wider, fueled by their voracious appetite for materials and the nightly escapes to the absinthe-soaked cafes of the town. The alcohol acts as an accelerant in the hazy, green-tinted atmosphere of the brothels and bars. The bickering turns vicious. Gauguin begins to mock Vincent's sentimental urgency, his excess of zeal. He paints a portrait of Vincent working on sunflowers, the very symbol of his welcome, but renders him with a look of slack-jawed mania. When Vincent sees it, his response is a quiet, devastating admission. It is me, certainly, but it is me gone mad. The weather turns, trapping them inside. The Mistral howls around the yellow house, sealing the exits and turning the small rooms into a pressure cooker. There is no escape to the fields, no sun to burn away the frustration. They are two incompatible elements locked in a jar, one fire, one ice. Vincent senses Gauguin pulling away. He sees the boredom in the Frenchman's eyes, the calculations being made about train schedules, and better opportunities in Paris or the tropics. The fear of abandonment, the old familiar terror that has dogged Vincent from the Borinage to the Rue Lepic, begins to rise like bile. He becomes possessive, erratic, oscillating between fawning adoration and sullen silence. The atmosphere is no longer one of artistic debate. It is the heavy, static-charged air of an approaching storm. Vincent's work from this period vibrates with a suppressed hysteria. The brushstrokes become more agitated, the colors more jarring. He is painting to keep the walls from closing in, painting to prove to Gauguin and to himself that he is worthy of this partnership. But the studio of the South is failing. The dream of a brotherhood of artists is dissolving into a domestic tragedy of two men who simply cannot breathe the same air. The electric arguments have short-circuited Vincent's fragile nerves. The house that was meant to be a sanctuary has become a theatre of psychological warfare, waiting for the final violent act that will shatter the utopia forever. Chapter 7. The Night of the Razor. The detonation, when it finally fractures the yellow walls, is not caused by a bomb, but by the terrifying quiet of abandonment. It is December 23rd, 1888. The Mistral has died down, replaced by a relentless, chilling rain that turns the streets of Arles into slick, black mirrors. Inside the studio of the South, the air is thick with the toxicity of unsaid things. Gauguin, the pragmatist, has made his calculations. He sees no profit in this madness, no future in the volatile orbit of a man who paints with the desperate energy of a drowning sailor. He announces he is leaving. For Vincent, this is not merely a roommate moving out. It is the apocalypse of his religion. The Brotherhood of the South, the monastery of light he starved himself to build, is dismantling itself before his eyes. The fear of solitude, always prowling at the edges of his mind like a wolf, now breaks down the door. He is frantic. He pleads. The dialogue of masters dissolves into the incoherent stammering of a frightened child. Gauguin, cold and terrified by the intensity of the Dutchman's gaze, flees to a hotel, leaving Vincent alone in the house that was supposed to be a sanctuary. Alone with the silence, alone with the voices that begin to rise from the corners of the room, louder than the wind, louder than the arguments. The logic of the world snaps. The high yellow note he has chased all summer screams into a pitch only he can hear. In a paroxysm of grief and severed connection, he collapses. He reaches for the razor. It is a frantic, jagged act of self-erasure, a desperate attempt to excise the pain, or perhaps to offer a grotesque token of penitence to a world that refuses to understand him. He wraps the severed flesh in newspaper, a gruesome gift delivered to a brothel door, the final, confused gesture of a man whose capacity for love has been warped by rejection into a horrific tragedy. The morning sun of Christmas Eve does not illuminate a temple of art. It rises on a crime scene. The police arrive. The studio of the South is now a spectacle for the curious neighbors. The floors stained not with chrome yellow or cobalt blue, but with the dark, iron reality of blood. Vincent is found unconscious, curled in the bed he bought for the future, barely clinging to a life he no longer knows how to navigate. He wakes up not in his yellow house, but in the sterile, white confinement of the Hôtel Dieu hospital. The walls are not adorned with his sunflowers. They are bare, stripping him of the color that sustained him. Dr. Felix Ray looks down at him, not with the judgment of the clerics in the Borinage, but with a clinical pity. The diagnosis is not sinner, but epileptic, madman, invalid. The labels cage him more effectively than any prison bars. Theo rushes from Paris, his face grey with terror, holding the hand of the brother who has finally fallen too far. But Theo cannot stay. His own life in Paris, his new fiancée, pulls him back. Vincent is left behind, marooned in the wreckage of his own mind. The shame is absolute. He writes to Theo, his handwriting shaky, stripped of the manic confidence of the summer. He speaks of contrition. He describes himself as degraded, a broken vessel that can no longer hold the sacred wine of art. The town of Arles, which he tried to paint with such tenderness, turns its back. The locals, who once viewed him as a harmless eccentric, now see a dangerous lunatic. They draft a petition, a cruel bureaucratic document demanding his removal. The red-headed madman must go. The yellow house is shuttered, its damp walls locking away the ghost of the Utopia that died that rainy December night. He sits in the hospital garden, watching the other patients, men and women, whose minds have also fractured under the weight of existence. He realizes with a crushing lucidity that he is one of them. The art credo, the dream of leading a new renaissance, is ash. He cannot trust his own brain. He cannot trust the hand that holds the brush, fearing it might again reach for the razor. The freedom he sought in the sunlight has become his enemy. He knows. With the heavy, dull final certainty of the defeated. He can no longer be the master of his own house. He needs walls. He needs a keeper. He looks toward the jagged peaks of the Arles mountains in the distance, where the asylum of Saint-Rémy waits like a stone fortress, ready to swallow the man who flew too close to the sun. Chapter 8. Sanctuary at Saint-Rémy. The heavy iron gates of Saint-Paul-de-Moselle do not slam shut. They click with the precise, mechanical finality of a diagnosis. It is May 1889. Vincent walks into the asylum not as a prisoner, but as a voluntary exile, a man surrendering his liberty to buy back his sanity. The silence here is different from the Borinage or the empty studio in Arles. It is the thick, medicated silence of the broken. He is given 2 rooms, one to sleep in and one to paint in. This concession, this recognition that the easel is as vital to his survival as bread or water, is his only tether to the world of the living. He looks around his cell. The wallpaper is a peeling grey-green skin. The curtains are heavy, but there is a window. Through the vertical slash of the iron bars, he sees a square of the world, an enclosed wheatfield, bounded by a wall, with the violet hills of the Arles rising behind it like a bruised spine. This view will become the most painted patch of grass in the history of art. It is his entire universe now. He tells Theo he is resigned, that he is like a broken pitcher. But the moment he picks up the brush, the resignation evaporates into a ferocious discipline. He attacks the wheatfield. He paints it at sunrise, when the reaper is just a shadow against the blazing gold. He paints it in the rain, when the soil turns to mud and the sky is a sheet of lead. He is documenting the cycle of growth and harvest with the intensity of a man who knows he might be cut down next. The work is no longer just a vocation, it is a lightning conductor. He believes that if he paints hard enough, if he concentrates on the architecture of a blade of grass or the shadow of a stone, he can keep the terror at bay. He is building a dam of canvas against the rising tide of his own mind. But the asylum is a place of rhythms, and not all of them are creative. The screams of other patients in the night, the smell of stale cabbage and carbolic acid, the sudden, terrifying lapses where his own memory dissolves. These are the new textures of his reality. When the attacks come, he is locked out of his studio. He is forbidden to touch the paints, lest he eat them in a desperate attempt to poison the demons in his stomach. In these periods of enforced idleness, the nature he worships is taken away. He is left with nothing but the terrifying inventory of his own brain. It is here, in the vacuum of the cell, that the argument with Gauguin is finally resolved, though not in the way he expected. Gauguin had urged him to paint from memory, to abstract the world. Vincent had refused, clinging to reality like a drowning man to a raft. Now, locked behind bars, memory is all he has. The high yellow note of the Arles sun has faded. The light here is cooler, sharper, filtered through the limestone dust of the mountains. He begins to synthesize. He mixes the reality of the Wheatfield with the hallucinations of his fever. And then comes the night. Insomnia is his constant companion, a jagged presence that paces the cell with him. He looks out the window, past the iron bars, into the pre-dawn darkness. The village of Saint-Rémy is hidden from his view, tucked away behind the asylum walls. But he paints it anyway. He conjures a small sleeping town from his Dutch past, a church spire that pierces the horizon like a needle. But the earth is not the subject. The subject is the sky. He paints the starry night, not as a lullaby, but as an apocalypse. The sky is not a passive backdrop. It is a roaring, churning engine of cobalt and chrome. The stars are not distant points of light. They are exploding nebulas, rolling in vast energetic waves that threaten to crash against the dark, jagged silhouette of the cypress tree. The cypress, the tree of mourning, the funeral marker of Provence, bridges the gap between the sleeping village and the violent heavens. It is a dark flame rising from the earth, the only vertical thing in a world of swirling chaos. This is not the scientific observation of the Impressionists. This is the vortex. Vincent has stopped painting what he sees and started painting what he feels. The atmosphere is fluid, heavy, conducting electricity like a wire. He is mapping the turbulence of his own soul onto the cosmos. He writes to Theo that the stars are the infinite, the only place where a man might finally find rest, transportation to which is achieved not by train, but by death. Yet, even as he paints this masterpiece of turmoil, he remains lucid, analytical. He describes the colors to Theo with the precision of a chemist. He is a man standing in the center of a hurricane, calmly taking notes on the wind speed. The starry night is his confession and his defiance. It is proof that while his mind may be fracturing, his vision is becoming terrifyingly whole. The brushwork has changed. The staccato dashes of Paris and the thick impasto of Arles have merged into something new. Long, rhythmic, undulating lines that coil and uncoil across the canvas. The static capture of light has been abandoned for the kinetic expression of energy. The paint no longer sits on the canvas. It flows, twisting twisting into a distinct, spiraling signature that mimics the very structure of the madness he is trying to outrun. Chapter 9: The Architecture of the Vortex. This new kinetic expression is not merely a stylistic flourish. It is a fundamental restructuring of how he perceives the physical world. In the isolation of Saint-Rémy, the peinture claire of Paris, and the solid, heat-baked blocks of Arles dissolve into something far more fluid and terrifying. Vincent is no longer painting objects. He is painting the invisible currents of air and energy that bind them together. The vortex is born not from hallucination, but from a hyper-acute observation that sees the universe as a restless, breathing organism. He abandons the staccato dots of the pointillists, those polite, scientific vibrations he learned from Surat. In their place, he develops a long, undulating brushstroke, a rhythmic line that does not sit on the canvas, but travels across it. These are not the tentative scratches of the Borinage charcoal. They are confident, muscular rivers of paint that flow with a specific mathematical intent. He is building the world again, stroke by heavy stroke, creating a masonry of color where every line supports the weight of the composition. It is an architecture of motion. The poet's garden evolves. The trees, once static sentinels in the parks of Arles, now begin to writhe. The olive trees of Saint-Rémy are not wood and leaf. They are silver, twisted into agony, their trunks convulsing as if trying to rip themselves from the dry earth. He paints them with a savage intensity, their foliage churning in a way that suggests a subterranean geological force pushing upwards. He writes that he wants to exaggerate the essential, to lie about the literal reality in order to tell the truth about the emotional one. He is rejecting the mechanical eye of the camera, which he despises, in favor of a suggestive color that bypasses the intellect and strikes directly at the nervous system. This is the high yellow note pushed to its absolute breaking point. The sun in his canvases ceases to be a celestial body and becomes a centrifugal force, a spinning reactor that warps the sky around it into halos of sulfur and chrome. The very air becomes tangible, a thick, swirling medium through which the cypress trees must fight to rise. These dark flames, the funereal markers of the south, are the anchors in this storm of motion, vertical scars of Prussian blue and black that hold the spinning heavens in check. He is mapping the turbulence of his own mind onto the landscape, finding a strange, rhythmic logic in the chaos. Yet, this artistic lucidity is a fortress built on sand. While his hand executes these exaggerations with the precision of a master surgeon, the man holding the brush is crumbling. The rich harvest of canvases stacking up in the asylum workroom masterpieces that will one day command the reverence of nations, are, in this moment, nothing but a burden of shipping costs and worry. The vortex on the canvas is contained, framed, and beautiful. The vortex in his life is spiraling out of control. He is creating the most sophisticated art of the century while eating stale bread and begging for paint tubes. A soaring intellectual giant, trapped in the shrinking existence of an invalid. The sheer velocity of his creation begins to strip the gears of his support system. It places an unbearable strain on the only lifeline that still tethers him to the sanity of the outside world, the fragile, fraying wire that leads back to Theo. Chapter 10. The Umbilical Cord, Theo's Burden. The wire that stretches from the asylum in Saint-Rémy to the apartment in Paris is not made of copper or steel. It is made of ink and paper. For Vincent, the postman is not merely a civil servant. He is the most important figure in his mythology, the courier of existence itself. If the letters stop, the world ends. We often speak of Vincent's solitude, framing him as the lone genius shouting into the void. But this is a romantic lie. He was never truly alone, because he was always speaking to Theo. This correspondence, which spans hundreds of letters and thousands of pages, is the longest, most desperate conversation in the history of art. It is the umbilical cord that keeps the broken picture from shattering completely. But an umbilical cord flows two ways, and we must now turn our eyes to the man on the other end of the line. Theo van Gogh is the silent architect of his brother's legend, a man who lives a double life. By day, he is the respectable art dealer at Bousseau, Valadon and Company, a man of impeccable taste who moves in the sophisticated circles of the Parisian avant-garde. By night, he is the keeper of a volatile flame, the exhausted guardian of a genius that the world considers garbage. Theo is the lungs through which Vincent breathes. Every tube of cobalt blue, every meter of canvas, every crust of bread eaten in the yellow house or the asylum is paid for by Theo's patience and Theo's franc. Vincent knows this. The guilt is a corrosive acid that eats away at his high yellow note. He writes constantly of money, not out of greed, but out of a paralyzing fear that he is a parasite. He refers to the heap of money he has consumed, a vast sum that has produced nothing but stacks of unsold paintings. That crowd Theo's apartment like unwanted guests. He tries to frame it as a business transaction, a partnership where he provides the labor and Theo provides the capital. But the ledger is terrifyingly unbalanced. Vincent is trading his life for paint, but the market is not buying. He tells Theo that he is working for the future, that the paintings will one day pay back the debt with interest. But in the dark quiet of the asylum, the doubt creeps in. What if they are just mad scratches? What if he is slowly bankrupting the only person who loves him? And then, the geometry of their relationship shifts. The binary star system of Vincent and Theo, two brothers orbiting each other in a closed loop of art and dependence, is suddenly disrupted by a third body. Theo falls in love. Her name is Johanna Bonga, a woman of intelligence and fortitude who steps into this tangled web of Dutch guilt and artistic ambition. They marry in April 1889. For Theo, this is the beginning of a life deferred. He is finally building a home, a future, a family that does not involve bailing his brother out of police stations or hospitals. For Vincent, locked away in the monastery of the mad, the news is a complex trauma. He expresses joy, for he loves his brother. But beneath the congratulations lies a primal terror. He is being replaced. The studio of the South, the dream of a brotherhood of artists. The entire architecture of his survival was predicated on Theo's undivided attention. Now, the resources must be split. The emotional bandwidth must be shared. He feels the umbilical cord stretching, thinning, threatening to snap. He fears that he is no longer the brother, but the burden, the embarrassing, earless relative locked away in the South while life marches on in Paris. The tension tightens when the news arrives that Jo is pregnant. A child is coming, a new life. Theo writes that they will name the boy Vincent. It is the ultimate tribute, a gesture of profound love intended to honor the artist. But for the man in Saint-Rémy, it feels like a haunting. There is already a Vincent van Gogh buried in the churchyard of their childhood home. The first brother who died at birth. Now, there will be a third. He feels like a ghost in his own timeline, a placeholder for a fresh, uncorrupted Vincent, who will perhaps live the life he failed to master. He writes to his mother, telling her he would have preferred they name the boy after their father, trying to deflect the honor that feels so heavy on his shoulders. The isolation of the asylum, once a sanctuary, now begins to feel like a tomb. The silence of the vortex is no longer protective. It is deafening. He needs to close the distance. He cannot bear the thought of the child growing up without knowing him. Or perhaps he cannot bear the thought of being forgotten by the new family unit. The North begins to call him back. He is done with the heat, done with the violent, lonely struggle of the Mistral. He craves the grey, damp familiarity of home, or at least something closer to it. But he cannot return to Paris. The city is too loud, too frantic for his shattered nerves, and he knows he cannot impose his instability on a house with a newborn baby. He needs a middle ground. He needs a place that is near Theo, yet separate. A place where he can be monitored, yet free. Theo, ever the caretaker, searches for a solution. He finds a name, recommended by the painter Pissarro. It is a village, just an hour north of Paris. A quiet, rustic hamlet watched over by a doctor who is an eccentric, a melomaniac, and a specialist in nervous ailments. The decision is made. Vincent packs his rich harvest into crates. He rolls up the starry night, the cypresses, the olive groves, the evidence of his suffering and his ecstasy. He is leaving the crucible of the south. He is reeling in the line, shortening the tether, moving to the final station of his pilgrimage. He boards the train north, leaving the sun behind to seek the care of Dr. Paul Gachet in a place called Auvers-sur-Oise. Chapter 11. The Philosophy of the Brush. To understand what happens next, to comprehend the final frantic 70 days that are about to unfold in Auvers, we must first dissect the weapon Vincent carries with him. He does not step off the train merely with crates of canvas and tubes of pigment. He arrives armed with a radical, hardened philosophy. The art credo is no longer a theory debated in Parisian cafes over absinthe. It is a theology forged in the fires of his own suffering. He has come to believe that the role of the artist is not to depict the world as it appears, but as it feels. This sounds simple to modern ears, accustomed to a century of abstraction, but in 1890, it is a heresy. The academies of Europe are still obsessed with the old dodges, the polished photographic perfection that lies about the messiness of being alive. Vincent despises this. He calls it moral cowardice. He seeks the raw, unadulterated truth, a truth that is often ugly, jagged, and uncomfortable. He writes that he would rather paint a peasant smelling of manure and toil than a sanitized porcelain figure that tells no story. The brush must not smooth over the cracks of existence. It must inhabit them. This demand for truth drives his obsession with the vibrant impasto. The paint is not a window to look through. It is a substance to be reckoned with. It is clay. It is mud. It is flesh. When he paints a cypress tree or a starry night, he is not copying nature. He is competing with it. He is trying to match the brutal energy of creation. Stroke for stroke. He speaks of attacking the canvas, of fencing with nature. It is a physical combat where the artist must be as rugged and exhausted as the ploughman he admires. He rejects the image of the artist as a delicate genius. He sees himself as a laborer, a weaver, a man with calloused hands who happens to work in the medium of eternity. And then there is the color. For Vincent, color has ceased to be a descriptive tool. It has become a language of vibration. He writes to Theo that color is the music of the eye. Just as a violin string vibrates to produce a sound that can induce tears, he believes that a specific juxtaposition of cobalt blue and chrome yellow can induce a spiritual state. He is looking for the high note, the optical frequency that bypasses the intellect and strikes directly at the nervous system. He wants his sunflowers to burn with the intensity of a Gothic stained glass window. To offer the same consolation to the viewer that religion once provided, he is trying to paint salvation, but this salvation comes with a terrifying exchange rate. Vincent has accepted, with a grim and lucid fatalism, that his art requires the consumption of his life. He views his poverty not as a temporary embarrassment, but as a necessary condition for the temple of his art. He is the ascetic monk who must starve so that the vision may remain pure. He calculates the price of a tube of paint against the price of a loaf of bread, and almost always chooses the paint. He describes himself as a traveler who is going somewhere, and the baggage of material comfort must be jettisoned to speed the journey. He is acutely aware that he is a man out of time. The industrial world is rising around him. The smoke of the factories, the roar of the trains, the cold logic of the machine, and he feels it as a threat to the human soul. His art is a counter-offensive. It is a desperate attempt to preserve the sanctity of the Wheatfield and the dignity of the sower in an age that values neither. He writes that he wants to paint men and women with that something of the eternal which the halo used to symbolize, but to do it through the radiance and vibration of our coloring. He is trying to re-enchant a world that science is stripping bare. This is the philosophy of the brush that he brings to Dr. Gachet's door. It is a heavy burden. He is not just a painter looking for a landscape. He is a prophet looking for a revelation. He has stripped himself of everything else. His health, his social standing, his romantic hopes, his very sanity, and poured it all into this singular, fanatical belief that a painted image can heal the broken. He is a man who has gambled his entire existence on the wager that art matters more than life. As he settles into the small room at the Auvers-sur-Oise, he is not resting. He is calibrating. The art credo is fully formed. The vortex has been mapped. The high yellow note has been heard. Now he simply needs the terrain to execute the final maneuver. He needs a landscape that can withstand the weight of his vision. He looks out at the fields of Auvers, vast, undulating and green, and sees the final battleground. The philosophy is about to meet its ultimate test, and the brush is wet with the anticipation of the end. Chapter 12. The Last Refuge, Auvers-sur-Oise. The train pulls into the small station at Auvers-sur-Oise on May 20th, 1890. It is spring, but the air carries a heaviness that has nothing to do with the weather. Vincent steps onto the platform, a man whittled down to his core, carrying the invisible weight of the asylum and the very visible burden of his canvases. He has come here for a cure, or at least for a keeper who can understand the peculiar dialect of his madness. He walks up the road to the home of Dr. Paul Gachet. He expects a savior, a medical authority with the sturdy constitution of a peasant. What he finds is a mirror. Gachet is not the rock upon which Vincent can anchor his drifting sanity. He is another ship lost in the same storm. The doctor is an eccentric, a widower surrounded by a chaotic menagerie of animals, and a house stuffed with bric-a-brac. A man whose eyes hold the same tormented expression that stares back at Vincent from his own looking glass. Vincent writes to Theo immediately, his observation sharp and devastatingly clinical. He is sicker than I am, I think, or shall we say just as much. It is a terrifying realization. The pilot of his rescue vessel is drunk on the same melancholy that is drowning the passenger. Yet, in this shared brokenness, they find a frantic, sympathetic rhythm. Gachet does not tell Vincent to rest. He does not prescribe the cold baths or the silence of the asylum. He prescribes the very poison that is killing him. He tells Vincent to paint. He tells him to throw himself into the work with all his might, to distract the demons with the sheer velocity of creation. And so, the final countdown begins. It is a period of 70 days that defies all logic of human endurance. In the quiet, thatched roof village of Auvers, Vincent does not merely work. He erupts. He produces a canvas a day. Sometimes two. It is a hemorrhage of genius, a desperate, breathless sprint to capture the world before the lights go out. He paints Gachet. He captures the doctor in his cap, leaning on a red table, clutching a sprig of foxglove, the digitalis plant used to treat heart conditions. A subtle nod to the heartache that consumes them both. But it is the face that arrests us. Vincent paints him with the heartbroken expression of our time, a sorrow that is modern, weary, and profound. It is not a portrait of a man. It is a portrait of a diagnosis. He renders the coat in a deep, pulsating blue, the background an undulating landscape of turquoise ridges, dissolving the solid doctor into the vibrating atmosphere of the Vortex. The landscape of Auvers differs from the sun-baked clarity of Arles, or the enclosed rigidity of Saint-Rémy. It is lush, green, and rolling. But under Vincent's brush, this pastoral serenity is warped into a restless, heaving ocean of earth. He paints the church at Auvers, but he grants it no stability. The building does not stand. It melts. The stained glass windows are dark. Blue-black eyes that refuse to let in the light. The path in the foreground splits, winding around the structure like a stream of molten lava, offering no clear way in. It is a monument to a god who has left the building, painted by a man who is still desperately knocking on the door. He moves into the fields. These are not the meticulously tilled plots of the asylum. These are vast, undulating plains of wheat that stretch out to the horizon, crushed under skies that are troubled and vexed. He writes to Theo of the vastness of these fields, describing them as an attempt to express sadness and extreme loneliness. The art credo has shifted again. He is no longer trying to teach us to see. He is trying to make us feel the crushing weight of the infinite. The brushwork becomes even more frantic. The disciplined swirls of the starry night loosen into jagged shorthand slashes. He is painting in a code that is breaking down. The strokes becoming shorter, more aggressive, as if he is stabbing the canvas rather than caressing it. He is trying to pin down the vitality of the wheat, the green of the vines, the white of the blossoms. But the vortex is now internal. It is no longer just in the sky. It is in the soil, in the walls, in the very air of the village. He lives in the Auvers-sur-Oise, renting a tiny attic room that smells of turpentine and cheap tobacco. It is a stifling box, blistering hot in the summer sun, but he spends little time there. He is out before dawn and back after dark, a ghost haunting the edges of the village. The locals watch him with a mixture of amusement and fear. This man with the mutilated ear and the intense, burning stare, who sets up his easel in the middle of the street and attacks the canvas as if fighting a duel. Yet, in his letters, there is a heartbreaking gentleness. He writes of the quietness of the country, of his passionate love for the mossy roofs and the chestnut trees. He is a man saying goodbye to a world he loves too much to live in. He worries constantly about Theo, about the baby, about the money. The guilt is a physical pain. He feels he is failing them, that his art is a bad investment, a drain on the resources of a young family. He seeks consolation in his work, but the work is consuming the last reserves of his spirit. The heat of July begins to rise, baking the damp plains of the Oise Valley. The high yellow note returns, but it is no longer the joyous, sacred yellow of the sunflowers. It is the sickly, anxious yellow of a storm sky. The peinture clair has not saved him. The studio of the South is a ruin. The brotherhood is a fantasy. He is alone in the middle of a vast wheat field, and the silence is no longer empty. It is filling up with a dark, rhythmic beating of wings. The landscape he has painted with such ferocity is beginning to close in, transforming from a sanctuary into a trap. Chapter 13. Wheatfield with Crows. The trap snaps shut on a canvas of roughly 50 by 100 centimeters. This is the Wheatfield with Crows, a rectangular slice of the apocalypse that has become, in the popular imagination, the suicide note of Vincent van Gogh. But to read it merely as a farewell is to underestimate the ferocious forensic intellect that is still operating behind the brush. It is July 1890. The high yellow note that Vincent chased through the sunflowers of Arles and the harvest of Saint-Rémy has reached a frequency that is no longer audible to the human ear. It is a scream of pigment. The wheat is not the benevolent golden sustenance of his earlier sour motifs. It is a turbulent, dirty ocean of ochre and brownish gold, beaten flat by an invisible wind. Above it, the sky is not the celestial, royal blue of the starry night, but a heavy, oppressive lid of indigo and violet. A troubled sky, as he describes it to Theo, fully conscious of the metaphor. And then there are the crows. They rise from the corn like debris from an explosion. Black, jagged shards of paint that scar the composition. Critics and romantics will later call them harbingers of death, the funeral cortege of a dying man. But look closer. These are not symbols of doom. They are mathematical notations of vastness. Vincent writes not of death, but of extreme loneliness, a solitude so profound that it requires these black strokes to give it scale. The birds are not attacking, they are fleeing. They are the only moving things in a landscape that has become a cul-de-sac. The composition itself is a rejection of all the rules of perspective he so painstakingly learned in the Borinage and the Hague. There is no center. 3 paths cut through the wheat. One to the left, one to the right, one through the middle. But none of them lead to a horizon. They lead nowhere. They are cut off, swallowed by the green-gold mass of the grain. It is the visual map of a man who has run out of options, a man standing at a crossroads where every turn leads back into the vortex. Yet, the art credo holds. Even here, at the edge of the abyss, the technical command is absolute. The brushwork is not the messy scrawl of a madman. It is a display of scintillating vitality that defies the crumbling mind that directs it. The strokes are deliberate, rhythmic, and brutally efficient. He is not losing control of his craft. He is using his craft to document the loss of his control. He paints with the lucidity of a fever, knowing that the electricity he felt in Arles is now short-circuiting. The physical fatigue is crushing. He is trying to do too much, working with a desperation that alarms even Dr. Gachet. The sheer velocity of his output, 70 canvases in 70 days, has burned through his reserves. He is a steam engine running without coal, fueled only by the fumes of his own anxiety. The letters to Theo change tone. The detailed requests for cobalt blue and emerald green become interspaced with heavy, leaden silences. He worries that he is a danger to the little one, Theo's son. He worries that the southern sun has permanently scorched his brain. He feels the storm gathering, not just in the sky above the wheat, but in the synapses of his own skull. He stands in the fields, the easel staking its claim in the soil, the Mistral of the north blowing through his red hair. The locals see him, the furu, the red-headed madman, staring at the crows as if they are speaking to him. But he is not listening to the birds. He is listening to the silence that follows them. The frantic energy of the Penchaclair is exhausting itself. The vibrant impasto is becoming a weight he can no longer carry. The theatricality of the vortex abruptly ceases. The storm does not break with a crash of thunder, but dissipates into the terrifyingly quiet, pedestrian reality of a Sunday afternoon at the Auvers-sur-Oise. Chapter 14. The Smoking Pipe. The violence, when it finally comes, is not the grand operatic crescendo that the swirling skies of his canvases might have promised. It is clumsy, quiet, and intimately human. On the afternoon of July 27th, 1890, the frantic productivity that has defined Vincent's existence for the last decade simply stops. He does not reach for a brush. He does not reach for a pen to write to Theo. He walks out of the Auvers-sur-Oise, past the wheat fields that have been his cathedral and his torment, and steps behind a manure heap near a farmyard wall. The vastness of the cosmos, which he mapped with such terrifying precision in the Starry Night, shrinks down to the small, cold reality of a borrowed revolver. He pulls the trigger, But even in this final act of negation, the clumsiness that plagued his social life and his early sketches returns. The bullet does not find the heart. It deflects off a rib, lodging deep in his belly, failing to grant him the immediate release he sought. The apocalypse is not instant. It is a slow, agonizing unraveling. He does not die amidst the golden wheat under the violet sky. He collapses. Then, with a grit that defies medical explanation, he stands up. He walks back to the inn. The scene that follows is haunting in its banality. The Ravu family is eating dinner. Vincent stumbles in, clutching his stomach, and moves quickly to his tiny attic room. When the innkeeper, alarmed by his groan, follows him upstairs and asks what is wrong, Vincent turns his face to the wall. "I tried to kill myself," he says, "but I missed." There is no hysteria. There is no sermon. There is only the factual reporting of a man who has treated his own life as a failed experiment. The doctors arrive. First a local practitioner, then Gachet. They probe the wound, but the bullet is too deep, the risk of surgery too high. They bandage him and leave him to the dark. And it is here, in the suffocating heat of the attic, that the final, definitive image of Vincent van Gogh emerges. He does not rage against the dying of the light. He does not pray for salvation. He asks for his pipe. For hours he lies in the narrow iron bed, propped up against the pillows, puffing rhythmically on the tobacco that has been his constant companion, his appetite suppressant, and his stimulant since the days of the Borinage. He is entirely lucid. The madness, the terror, the storms that ravaged his mind in Arles and Saint-Rémy have receded, leaving behind a terrifyingly calm clarity. He sits with his wits about him, smoking quietly, waiting for the end of the chapter. He has silenced the Vortex when Theo bursts into the room the next day, terrified and breathless from the rush from Paris. He finds his brother not in the throes of a seizure, but in a state of stoic resignation. The reunion is heartbreakingly tender. Theo, the faithful steward, the man who has carried the weight of Vincent's existence for years, fights back tears, desperate to believe that this is just another crisis, another wound that can be healed. He speaks of hope, of recovery. Vincent looks at him with the heavy, lidded eyes of a man who has seen the machinery of the universe too clearly to be lied to. The sadness will last forever, he says. These words, La tristesse durera toujours, are often interpreted as a statement of depression, but in the context of that small, stifling room, they feel more like a law of physics. He is not complaining. is observing, he has painted the sorrow of the miners, the sorrow of the prostitutes, the sorrow of the crushing isolation in the asylum. He knows that the high yellow note of joy is fleeting, but the blue undercurrent of suffering is eternal. He bears no resentment toward humanity for this. He does not curse the critics who ignored him or the women who rejected him. He simply accepts the gravity of the human condition. The two brothers sit together for hours, the air thick with smoke and the unspoken bond that has tethered them across countries and crises. The umbilical cord is intact to the very last. Vincent tells Theo that he did it for the good of everybody. A final, crushing manifestation of his belief that he was a burden, a financial leak that threatened Theo's new family. He's trying to balance the ledger with his life. At 1:30 in the morning on July 29th, the pipe goes out. The smoke clears. Vincent van Gogh dies in the arms of his brother, aged 37. The steam engine has finally run out of coal. The man who tried to evangelize the world with charcoal, who tried to save it with color, who tried to build a utopia in a yellow house, is gone. The body is laid out in the coffin, and over it they drape a white cloth, but the room does not stay white. Theo, broken and weeping, surrounds his brother's body with the only flowers available in abundance: sunflowers and yellow dahlias. Even in death, Vincent is submerged in the color of the sun. The funeral is small. A handful of friends from Paris, including Émile Bernard and Père Tanguy, take the train to Auvers. They walk up the hill to the cemetery, struggling under the blistering July sun. The same sun that Vincent tried to capture. The same sun that perhaps burned him too deeply. Dr. Gachet tries to speak a eulogy, but chokes on his tears, managing only to say that Vincent was an honest man and a great artist. They lower him into the earth, into the very soil he painted with such vibrant impasto, leaving him near the wheat fields that witnessed his final, desperate act. The grave is simple. There is no monument yet, just a mound of earth in a French village, covering a man who died believing he had failed. But as the mourners disperse and the train carries them back to Paris, they leave behind more than a corpse. They leave behind a legacy that is about to undergo a transmutation, as violent and absolute as the one Vincent sought in the alchemist's fire of his art. Chapter 15: The Resurrection of the Sun. The transmutation does not begin in the galleries of Paris, nor in the auction houses that will one day trade his sorrow for millions. It begins in the body of Theo van Gogh. The bullet that entered Vincent's chest seems to have travelled through the invisible umbilical cord that connected them. directly into Theo's heart. The younger brother, the functionary of the Goupil Gallery, the rock upon which the church of Vincent was built, crumbles. He returns to Paris a man hollowed out. The storehouse of knowledge, the arsenal of art they had built together, is suddenly just a collection of canvas and oil in a silent apartment, without the high yellow note of Vincent's letters to sustain him. Theo's own life force dissipates. He survives his brother by only 6 months. It is as if the symbiotic pact they made in the mill at Refuge to strive for the good together required them to exit the stage together. Theo dies in Utrecht in January 1891, a victim of syphilis and sorrow, but mostly of a severed connection. He is buried first in Utrecht, but later, in a final act of curatorial justice, his body is moved to Auvers-sur-Oise. He is laid to rest next to Vincent under the same ivy that weaves their 2 graves into a single green organism. The brothers in Paris, the dealer and the creator, are finally united in the only soil that ever truly accepted them. But as the flesh returns to the earth, the art credo begins to rise. The vortex that Vincent feared, the swirling madness that consumed his mind, detaches itself from the pathology of the man and becomes the energy of the work. The sick man, the tippler, the furu who frightened the children of Arles, undergoes a resurrection that is nothing short of alchemical. The chrome yellow that he bought with his food money, that aggressive pigment of his madness and joy, does not fade. Instead, it begins to burn with a radioactive intensity that the 19th century is not yet ready to process. The recognition comes slowly, like the sunrise he painted in the Wheatfield. It starts with the free spirits, the painters who saw in his vibrant impasto not a lack of finish, but a new language of emotion. It spreads through the publication of the letters, the private mail that we have been reading, what was once the desperate confession of a lonely man, becomes the New Testament of modern art. The world begins to see what Vincent saw. We begin to look at a cypress tree and see a dark flame. We look at the night sky and see a churning engine of energy. He has not just painted the world, he has rewired our optical nerves to perceive his consolation. The tragedy of the Yellow House, the failure of the Studio of the South, is rewritten as a victory. The failed painter who could not sell a single canvas in his lifetime becomes the architect of the future. His exaggerations, his lies that were truer than the literal truth, become the foundation upon which expressionism, fauvism, and modernism are built. The peinture claire that he sought to capture, that blinding Japanese clarity, finally breathes not in the lungs of the man, but in the immortality of the image. History is cruel in its irony. The man who felt he was a broken pitcher, who believed he had failed to save his brother, becomes the most luminous light in the history of art. He is no longer the worshipper of the eternal Buddha, sitting in the lotus position in the fire. He is the fire. His suffering, once a private shame, becomes a universal currency of empathy. The sun he swallowed in Provence now radiates out from every museum wall in the world, a nuclear reactor of yellow that will never cool down. The vortex is silenced, but the motion remains. It is there, in the thick, sculptural ridges of the paint. It is there, in the rhythmic, undulating lines that refuse to be contained by the frame. It is the pulse of a man who loved the world with a terrifying intensity, who burned himself to ash, so that we might see the light